Hey, it's Samantha Hartley of the Profitable Joyful Consulting Podcast, and I want to welcome you to Season 5. I'm amazed and delighted that I made it to Season 5, and I did so with your support. So thank you so much for listening and for viewing. I really do appreciate you. What I'm going to talk about this season is consulting advice, and I chose this topic because as consultants, we are so often around people who want to tell us what to do. Either, don't charge by the hour, or, always get paid first, or you should write a book. So I wanted to take that advice and really turn it over and examine it and consult with a couple of experts on what they think. So that's what I'm going to be bringing to you this season. And since the topic is consulting advice, what I thought we would talk about today is how to give advice effectively. One of my favorite ways to phrase advice when I give it comes from kind of an unusual source, which is a book called Where People Fly and Water Runs Uphill. It's by Jeremy Taylor, and it's about dream interpretation. And in dream interpretation, what sometimes happens is that people will come together in small groups to share their dreams with each other and figure out what they mean. And these dream circles have some protocols of how you do things. And one of the protocols is that the way that you give feedback on someone else's dream isn't to say, well, what that means is that you hate your mother. That's a terrible way to phrase feedback about someone else's dream. And so what they recommend when you're giving feedback or advice to other dream members is to say, well, if it were my dream, it would mean, and then you talk about from your perspective, what the meaning would be. And I really love this advice for helping us to align ourselves with the recipient of our advice. My veterinarian used this construction one time when we were making a decision. And she said, well, if it were my dog, what I would do is, and then she gave me her treatment recommendation. And what I thought was so helpful about that was, I want to know what she would do if it were her dog. I share her values, I respect her, and she's an expert where I am not. And so if we're aligned in every place except for me knowing exactly what to do, I wanted to hear that from her. So I recommend you try on that kind of phrasing sometime when you're giving feedback. What I've noticed when I do, I see clients having that same kind of reaction where they feel that I've aligned with them and that the advice that I give them next is going to be, from my heart. I also put this in my agreements with my clients where I say, I'm going to treat your business as if it were my own. And if there's budget, I say, I'll spend your money as if this were my business. So it helps us to know, I'm taking this as seriously as if it were my situation or my business. So try on that phrasing, and I'm going to give you a few other ways to give feedback today and to give advice. But before I get into that, what I wanted to talk about was, in order to give advice effectively, people need to be prepared to receive that advice. And literally the first way that we can tell that we should give advice is that they ask for it. And I think it's important to point that out because even though we're brought in as consultants to a company, it doesn't always mean that they are asking for advice. I know that seems crazy, but what you'll notice is if you give advice when they aren't ready for it, then it doesn't work. So the first thing is that you want them to have asked for advice before you give it. And to really feel that permission is there. And you might even say, I just want to be clear, are you asking for advice? Or are you venting? Or, what would you like to hear at this moment? So that will help your clients to be more receptive. And I think you might notice if you're the kind of person who tends to give advice when people haven't necessarily asked for it, or if you've given advice before and not found that it was very well received, then that might be the situation. So in general, I think that that's an important thing to say and just to get out of the way, because it seems like it should be obvious that we've been called in and they want advice, but I do promise you it isn't. And one of the ways that I know it isn't is the second thing that I want to bring up, which is that the client or potential client acknowledges that they have a problem. Acknowledging that they have a problem means that they have admitted to it. They have specified where they have a gap or a need, and what you are sharing with them is going to help them to close that gap or need. And this, I've noticed, it can be You can see resistance in this area usually in two places. So one is before you have signed on a client. So I have been in situations where a referral partner has brought me in and said, oh my gosh, you really need to work with this person. They really need you. So I'll take a meeting. And during that meeting, it becomes clear that the potential client does not feel that they have a problem or need. Nothing is broken for them. So we'll have asked questions, probing questions in this intake process, and they are fine. Everything's cool for them. So I've left a couple of meetings with referral partners where they've said, oh my gosh, see how much she needs you? She really needs you. And I will say, she doesn't have a problem. Nothing is broken for her. And so that is not a situation that I can come into and I can't make that better. Like they need to say that something is wrong. The other situation where you'll see this is usually not the person who brought you into a consulting engagement, but someone who works for them who isn't down for change. They did not want this. And so when you are talking with them, you'll hear resistance to any acknowledgement that any situation needs to change. So I don't have a problem. We don't need to do anything differently, all the blah, blah, blah. And that's not going to be a person who's going to be receptive to your advice. And you're going to have to work around that. The last example I'll give you is I was brought in to to explore working with this company by a very high level, like a C-level person. And she brought me in for the executive team and the president was sitting there. And so I asked them several questions. And then what I would do is I would float pieces of advice. So they say don't coach in your consultations. The way that I like to coach in consultations isn't to push everything aside and say, okay, so here's what you need to do in your situation. What I will do is, as we're talking about things, I will float high-level ideas like, well, is it possible that there's a situation here? Or do you need to do something more with people? Do you need to bring in outside sales? So I will float a couple of ideas during the actual consultation because I'm looking to see how they're received. One of my qualifiers for working with a client, and whether they're a perfect client or not, is the way they receive advice. Like, how do they take that in? How do they respond to it? Are they defensive? Are they interested? Well, in this situation, the president of the company would respond to each piece of advice with, no, we really yada yada, or no, we tried that and it didn't work, or no. Every sentence began with the word no, and then like a comma, and then something else. In some situations, he wasn't even actually disagreeing with me. It was just that the first word of the sentence was no. And I was like, I can't help this company because I can't, if you have to go through a wall of no in order to get anywhere, it's just not going to work. So you're listening for people asking for advice. You're listening for receptivity to that advice in the form of acknowledging a problem or a desire to change and being open to that advice. In the form of like, oh, yes, interesting, or, oh, I hadn't thought of that, or some other way that they are open and receiving that advice. The third thing that I want you to watch out for when you're giving consulting advice is, and I hope this doesn't get me a PG rating on my iTunes, but there's a term that we will use in the coaching industry to refer to a certain kind of person, which is an ask hole. An ask hole is a person who is constantly asking questions, but then doesn't take action on the answers that they heard. So they'll either ask the same question over and over again, or they'll ask different questions, but never take any action or do any moving whatsoever. And it can sometimes take you a little while to notice that dynamic. So you'll hear a lot of questions and you're sincerely answering them. And then after a while, you start to see, you know what? Seems to be this funny little pattern where they don't actually do anything with what we talk about. So you want to be discerning with your advice in that situation. And after a certain point, it's okay to say, hey, I noticed that you've got a lot of questions, but you haven't moved anywhere. Can we talk about why the movement isn't happening? Why you're not taking action on what you've heard? Now, to be fair, in some situations, people need to ask the same question in a few different versions before they hear the advice in a way that helps them to take action on it. I think that's fair. But perpetually asking and never doing anything is definitely going to be a problem, and it's not going to help you to be effective nor them either. Something I think is very important in how we give advice to our clients is to be direct. Like a lot of times you just really have to tell them the truth, and we are the ones who've been called in to speak truth to power. Like no one else can tell them this truth. And it's, you want to be polite and considerate and kind and all of those things. But the fact is that sometimes you just have to say it. And I saw a wonderful example of this. I was working with a restaurant consultant, And he took a call with a potential client, and it would have been very easy for him to say, well, yes, sure, for this amount of money, I can come in and help you. And what he basically told them was, you need to close your restaurant. You need to close this business. And it was a difficult conversation for him because he felt like he was shattering people's dreams. And because it was, we all feel like we can help anybody in any situation, but he was just too experienced to not know that the business was doomed. So I talked with him before he got on that call, and we really just went through how to deliver that advice. And, luckily he had so much authority and credibility with the client that he was able to say that. So whether you're giving very, difficult feedback like that or negative feedback, for example, you've done a 360-degree assessment of a leader, and now you have to tell them that all of their peers have expressed these concerns and problems with them, that can be a difficult conversation, but that's when we really have to deliver things directly, just really tell the truth to people. And I've always called those kind of like grown-up conversations, because just, in my background, we didn't come to people and just speak to them frankly and directly in that way. We were always like polite to your face and mean behind your back kind of people in the South. But again, as professionals, this is what we need to do, is we need to really find ways to have those difficult conversations. And whether it's like, you can't work here anymore, you're not performing, whether it's your peers find you a really difficult person or whatever, I do think it's very helpful to get in the habit of being able to say things like that directly, without emotion, and in ways that are kind and supportive of our clients. I heard someone talking recently about how lonely it was for her at the top of her business, and that she wasn't able to get advice from really anyone because no one knew her business as well as her team and her employees, but she couldn't really talk with them because any decisions that she would make would affect them as well. So I think having that objective advice outside of your direct reports and your peer group and the people that are working for you is so critical and important. And I think to me, that's why it's so important for us to be, fair, direct, and honest. So I have a couple of ways that I like to give advice. And the first one, is the classic sandwich feedback. It's like, a nice thing and then the difficult thing, or the honest thing, and then another piece of sandwich, which is something else nice. And what I like about that is I think it helps people to have templates for doing things that are difficult. So if someone has to, they're doing annual reviews, which by the way shouldn't be done annually, should be done ongoingly, but nevertheless, they're doing annual reviews and they're like, here's how you're doing great. Here's some things that we'd like to see improved. And by the way, here's other things that are great. We really appreciate you. So that sandwich feedback format, I think, can really work for some people. For me, what I will tell my clients is I just dismiss with the bread and I go straight for the meat. And the reason I do that is because I really like to be effective and efficient. And I think people know from me what they're doing well. I'm generous with that feedback. And I want to be able to give them advice that says, I'm thinking about you. I want you to be rich. I want you to be successful. Here's what I want you to do. So whether sandwich or more direct is right for you is going to depend on you and on your clients, because different people receive advice differently according to what they feel ready to hear. And that's really the next thing that I wanted to mention is I was called in one time on a consulting engagement for a group of young people who were working as part of a really hierarchical organization. And they really did not like the hierarchy. They didn't like the people at the top, and they were really struggling with that. And they'd been away on a retreat, and I was asked to go in and kind of help them summarize their ideas for presentation to the top of the hierarchy. And I went in and they had flip chart pages of issues with top leadership, just pages and pages of them. And so what I worked with them on was, how do we present this so that top leadership can actually hear and take this in? So what I had to tell them was, you can't take forward the 30-page thing, because if you do, it will dilute your message. What's important for us is to choose what's the one thing from here that we can take in that they will be able to hear and do something with. And I've often been in this situation with clients where they want to say something, whether they want to say something to an employee or to a partner, and they want to tell the whole gory truth. And I know I've just said that we have to speak truth to power. These are situations when if you let loose on someone, they're going to get overwhelmed by the emotion of it, or they're going to get overwhelmed by the volume of that feedback and shut down, and it won't be able to be received. And because effectiveness is one of my top 5 values, it's important to me that we can't. That's when we have to take all of our need for getting for self-expression and for getting that all out of us. We have to balance that with the need for effectiveness. And so what I will ask is, what's the closest thing you can say to the truth that they can still hear? Sometimes it'll help you to have an objective person who can give you insight on that, because you'll feel like, well, they can hear this. And the objective observer will say, no, that probably will not go down very well. So with a group of young people, we got it down to a message that they felt good about. They felt that was the thing that they needed to express, and the rest of it they could bring up later when we'd had maybe time to come to the table with the top hierarchy. So when you're giving advice, I want you to think, especially if it's difficult advice or emotional, what's the closest thing that I can say to the truth that they can still hear? So if it's, 100% of the people in your organization hate you and don't want you to work here anymore, how do we turn that into something that's effective that we can tell that person so that they can actually use that feedback? That's sometimes our job as consultants, is to buffer this incredibly difficult thing and turn it into something that, to transform it into something that's useful. The last thing, I love this quote. I'm sure you've seen it before, and I think it's just really helpful to bring in when we're thinking about giving consulting advice. It's the acronym THINK, THINK. So before we say anything, we want to ask ourselves, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? I hope that when you're giving advice to your clients, to your peers, colleagues, and to your team members, that you are able to say the closest thing to your truth that can still be heard by them and that is still effective in getting results. And with that, I wish you a profitable and joyful consulting business. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to get video updates. Thanks.